thank you for participating in the Humane Summit, a virtual speaker series brought to you by the Humane Education Coalition. This session is sponsored by the Griffin Press and the Humane Society of the United States. We are grateful for your attendance today for Dr. Stephanie Itle-Clark's speaker session, What Has Bias Got to Do with It? Recognizing Impact of Stereotypes and Reducing Bias in Education. Stephanie is the founder and president of the Academy of Prosocial Learning. She specializes in humane pedagogy and supporting educators as they develop lessons that infuse humane and prosocial education into the standards-based curriculum in order to increase learner growth in the cognitive, affective, and behavioral domains. She also holds certified humane education specialist credentials. At this time, I will pass things over to our speaker, Stephanie Itle-Clark.
Welcome to my session today. I'm so excited that you could join me. We know as educators, especially educators working in humane and prosocial education, we want to end injustice and we want to create a world in which positive and prosocial behavior is the norm. One of the things that gets in our way is bias. So in this session, we're going to quickly look at what that is, why it happens, and a few ways that we can work toward ending it. I'm going to start out with a few pictures that I want you to look at. It's a short series. I want you to privately reflect upon your first thoughts when you see them. I want you to think about if your first reaction is to find similarities or to find differences. All right, are you ready? Right, so as you looked at those pictures, what kind of conversation did you realize you were having with yourself? Did you find more similarities? Did you find more differences? At any point, did you perhaps stop yourself because you thought of something that made you feel uncomfortable? And in some instances, did you find you were trying harder to find similarities because you really believe in the tenets of humane education? We did that activity so that we could process how quickly we try to make decisions or we try to categorize. And we want to talk now about what can sometimes get in the way of forming connections with those who are different than us. And believe it or not, it is our own brain. The human brain is guilty of stereotyping, and this can lead to bias. A stereotype is a cognitive shortcut, right? It allows your brain to make a quick snap judgment based on something that's immediately visible, like a characteristic such as gender, race, or age. A stereotype is a generalization of a full category of people. Right? And unfortunately, this can encourage prejudice. We may not try to use stereotypes, but we do begin from an early age to classify information. And so our brain becomes very practiced at categorizing. And whether we like it or not, we all use stereotypes all the time without knowing it. Right? I love this quote. We've met the enemy of equality, and the enemy is us. And so we want to think of our brain as a filing system that tries to process all of the information that's coming in. Remember the photos that you looked at? I bet there were a few where you stopped your brain from its initial thought, or in essence, you changed the mental file that you put it in. And that's because, according to the scientist John Powell, only about 2% of our emotional cognition is conscious, meaning 98% of our emotional cognition is done unconsciously. So if our brain is hardwired to make these categories or to make these quick calls, we can make ourselves perhaps feel a little better by realizing that it served as a survival mechanism. New York University Associate Professor David Amedio wrote in his 2014 paper called The Neuroscience of Prejudice and Stereotyping that the capacity to discern us from them is fundamental in the human brain. And that although this computation takes just a fraction of a second, it sets the stage for social categorization, right? That means stereotypes, prejudice, and unfortunately, it can cause conflict and inequality. And the brain categorizes on so many different types of factors. This is unconsciously done, right? So it's unconscious bias. It's immediate, it's reflexive, and unfortunately, it's often a defensive reaction to what our brain considers the other, the out group. This is called in-group bias, and it leads us to assign positive characteristics or motivation to people who appear to be similar to us. Biases like these are natural. They're used again as a cognitive shorthand for making quick social judgments in situations where we may be uncomfortable. So if our brain's wired to make these quick judgments, how is this a problem and how does it impact our humane education programs? Well, first, obviously, if we as educators are part of a majority group with more social or economic or political power than a minority one, these unconscious stereotypes can really limit opportunities for our learners. These accumulated and often unconscious stereotypes can accidentally guide our reactions or our actions. And we need to learn to stop the stereotype at that initial impulse, right? To recategorize the file. We have to learn to recognize it. And that takes work. Stereotypes can get in the way because they also create bias, which is basically an action that's based on the belief that the stereotype is true. Bias is judgment that's based on a personal point of view, and it can really impact our behaviors or our choices without us even consciously knowing. And unfortunately, these unconscious biases can create a contrast between the actions we take and how we really choose to align the way we live. When we're talking about education, stereotypes and bias can have a lot of effects. Now, we covered earlier that the brain is trying to categorize or generalize, right? And that's one of the effects of stereotype and bias. And that's actually one of the really big impacts in education. When the brain is trying to categorize, it's generalizing an entire group. And it's allowing us to separate these groups from ourselves. And that can reduce the amount of empathy that we have for those people or those animals in that generalized group. Now, if any of you do marketing, you probably know that you have a more successful campaign if you focus on the individual animal or the individual person. And that's exactly because it reduces generalizations. Now, another effect on education is self-fulfilling prophecy. And most of us have probably heard of this one. This is when we believe an inaccurate thing about a person or an animal, and then only look for those things that reinforce our beliefs. Now, if any of you who are with me today have ever had a group of siblings, you may have experienced self-fulfilling prophecy, or you have seen it in your organization. Perhaps the first sibling to come through has trouble in a certain subject or has caused a problem in the school in a way. If this family is generalized, it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy that the teachers or the educators are looking for this same type of behavior in all the following siblings, whether it's fair or not. Now, connected to self-fulfilling prophecy is stereotype threat. When an individual is aware of negative stereotypes about them or their social group, it can really undermine their performance. Right. So we know that there is a stereotype out there that there are certain races that are better at math, and there's a negative stereotype often heard that white women may not be as good at math as others. Well, of course, that would cause anxiety and may cause that woman to conform to a stereotype threat. Now, sadly, stereotype threat means that when we hear we're not supposed to be good at something, we underperform, often unconsciously. Think about the impact that has on your learners. On the other hand, if students hear they're supposed to be good at something, right, or if they know that someone believes in them, they're much more likely to do well. These three are just a few of the effects that we can see in the classroom that are caused by stereotype and bias. Now, we mentioned just a few slides ago that many times people report a certain self-perception, right? They say they want to act a certain way. However, when researchers observe if their actions line up with this report or self-perception, what they often find is that the unconscious beliefs kick in and overrule how the individual has reported they want to act. And what's often found is that people report who they want to be or what they want to do. This is one of the reasons why humane and prosocial education is so important, right? We want to support people in their desire to be their best possible self and to treat others with compassion. By using humane education, we can give them opportunities to process their feelings as well as practice these prosocial actions. Basically, we want to help them strengthen the part of the brain that they don't use. So let's end the last part of our session by looking at how we can do that. So if our brain has two systems, right, that impact the capacity for reflexive decision-making, we want to strengthen the one that is going to help people think the most critically and not generalize. So these systems are what Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman calls System 1, that's fast and intuitive and can make mistakes, and System 2, the one that thinks a little bit more slowly, it's more analytical, it's more thoughtful and deliberate. What we want to do is strengthen system number 2, the one that we desire, the one that made you perhaps stop when we were looking at some of those pictures and say, no, I don't want to categorize this person in this way. I choose to do it in a different way, right? When we first started our session. So let's look at the first tool we can use. The one tool we can use both ourselves as educators and we can share with our learners, no matter how old they are, we can teach them to use this. It's the ladder of inference. It can really strengthen System 2 in our brains. The ladder of inference was developed by Chris Argent, and it's a model of the steps that people use to make sense of situations and to then determine how they're going to act. The ladder of inference helps us to think about our thinking, right? It helps us to build perspective of how others may think or understand the world. Now, how we act depends on how we understand the situation we're in. So if you look at the bottom of the screen, that's our pool of data. And we all have our own pool of data based on our own personal experiences that we've accumulated throughout our life. Right? And each person basically works their way up the ladder and comes to an understanding based on their own pool of data and the things that they notice and how they interpret the situation. So if you look at the second rung, selected data, if an individual observes an activity or sees an animal or a person, they need to select from their pool of data what they believe they're seeing. They draw meaning, assumption, conclusion, belief, and that drives their action. We know that we can, unfortunately, jump to the wrong conclusion based on incorrect assumptions, meaning, and the wrong data. If we can slow our brain down, if we can stop just enough to question ourselves and say, am I selecting the right data? And if we can teach our learners to do the same thing, instead of jumping to a conclusion that's going to drive belief and action, an individual can go back down to a pool of data and say, maybe I don't have the right information. Maybe I need to look at other data before I draw meaning. Current research is suggesting that our unconscious thinking, as opposed to our deliberate or conscious thinking, is shaped by ideas formed from our experiences. Right? And so we know this is our pool of data. And so when we stop just long enough to question if our pool of data may be incorrect, it can change completely our interactions with other individuals, and it can help us to increase our empathy. Well, some of the other benefits of using the ladder of inference and some tips to use it in your personal practice would be to work with your students to get them to think reflectively, to understand that their conclusions are based on their own personal experience. And if we help them understand that other individuals have different experiences, it can help them with bullet 2 that just popped up, is that that's assuming that the reasoning process may have errors that they didn't see. So they need to go back and get more information. We want to work with our students to use examples, to talk through how we came to our conclusions. We can also do that with our peers so that they can understand our logic and our thinking and correct us if we've made perhaps an incorrect assumption. Paraphrasing out loud is really helpful as well, and that relates to using the examples. And one of the biggest things is assuming that others might reach a different conclusion because they have their own ladder of inference. And when we realize that, it can make us, instead of jumping to conclusions, getting angry, assuming that someone is definitely in the out group and we want nothing to do with them, it can get us to ask questions. And we can retrain the brain. We can retrain the brain to not categorize as often, to not use those stereotypes, and to find ways to override the quick reactions. Basically, we know from research that's out there now that human brains are able to be nudged, even if there are stereotypes. The human brain is capable of taking in new information and being nudged in an opposite direction. So the first is, of course, you as an educator, you are a model. Right? Show the students that you know how to think critically, that you can acknowledge and respect the feelings of others, even if you perhaps disagree. And part of this is even admitting feelings of bias when they go through your head. Oh yeah, when I grew up, there was this stereotype that we were told. I know it's not true, but it's still in the back of my mind, right? I think we can all think of a stereotype that maybe we were taught when we were young that we now know is incorrect information. Basically, we're modeling that slowing the brain down, we're strengthening the system too, and we're incorporating the ladder of inference for our students. The second thing we can do to retrain our brain is expose ourselves to different experiences with different people and different animals. Many of us grew up in areas where perhaps we're only exposed to certain animals. It can lead to biases. One of the ones that I was speaking with a colleague recently about was that, have you ever heard a good story about a hyena? No, right? So we need to expose ourselves to those different experiences. Look for commonality. Use language for power and not oppression. Begin to practice mindfulness, right? And as an educator, we can be aware of personal thoughts and reactions to what's going on around us, and we can teach our learners to do the same thing, right? To be in the moment, to understand what's happening around them. Listen to the stories of others. Stories are a very powerful way to build context, to add to that pool of data. And it can help us to connect to others. And of course, we also know that stories help us to build empathy because the brain connects to those very well. Begin to increase your microaffirmations, right? Start with small acts to help others succeed and keep going with those. It will help them become comfortable with us as well. And the use of generalizations, right? Because we know that when we generalize, it reduces empathy. And we want to work on communication strategies, right? Feelings are different than words and actions. We want to help our learners express how they truly feel, right? We may have to help them explore new words. And finally, the last way to retrain our brain is to build perspective. Building perspective is like teaching learners to be detectives. It's teaching them to search for clues to understand the situation. People who are really skilled at perspective taking, they look for clues to understand the other people or other animals in their environment. We can help students and learners in our programs to develop these sleuthing skills by encouraging them to observe and evaluate other people's actions or behaviors. Humane education is concentrated around the idea that we want to support prosocial attitudes and behavior. We know that humane education combines the domains of learning, and the skill of perspective taking combines the cognitive and the affective domain. Perspective taking is a social, emotional, and intellectual skill, and it requires our brains to understand and process empathy. And empathy is a process with both cognitive and affective components, right? And that enables each of us to understand and respond to each other's emotional states. It's what we want to build in our learners. So as I prepare to leave you, there's 4 final things I want that you can incorporate into your humane education lessons. And the first is we want to create an environment that's inclusive, right? Where there's multiple groups of people, animals, and places that are represented. We want to teach individuality as well. We want to help our learners distinguish the individuals of groups that are different than themselves so that the generalizations are reduced. We know that the most impactful way to incorporate humane education or humane pedagogy is to make sure it is multiple lessons and that you're bringing in multiple emotions and faces to help build that understanding. Of course, be aware of different types of bias. One of them is gender bias, and that can range anything from the praise that's given, making sure it's done equally for things like neatness, effort, appearance, strength, right? And having equal amounts of materials with strong characters of both genders. So if you look at stories and you find out all the heroes are always male, right? It just means it's time to incorporate some new stories. And finally, be aware of bias towards certain animals. So I mentioned the fact that the poor hyena, there's a lot of bias toward that animal. So try to reduce that if you notice it's occurring in any of the lessons, the stories, or the materials that are there, right? We know that all animals play a part in the ecosystem. So we want to recognize the positive that each of those brings, right? Even snakes, rats, bats, and bugs. So incorporating humane and prosocial education or empathy education into your classroom culture or unwritten curriculum is one of the most powerful things that you can do. I encourage you to learn more about it, to make it your signature pedagogy, and your learners will benefit the most when empathy education is not just a special event. It's not a one-time presentation or a guest speaker. The most impact in reducing bias and increasing empathy is made when humane pedagogy is the true core of our teaching practice. Well, this is a topic where all of us can continue to learn more. So I encourage you to visit us at the Academy of Prosocial Learning, get to know some of our resources, ask us any questions if you have any. And then there's two sites, things I wanted to share with you. Educational Leadership, Unconscious Bias When Good Intentions Aren't Enough. And you can find that article online. You can also find from the Greater Good Science Center at UC Berkeley, 4 ways teachers can reduce implicit bias. Thanks so much for joining me. I hope you continue to learn about bias and enjoy the rest of the summit.
This concludes our speaker session. Thank you so much for joining us. You can learn more here or by clicking the resource links in the summit. We hope you've enjoyed this speaker session and that you'll join us for another one soon. Please consider making a donation to the Humane Education Coalition to help us continue providing programs and events like the Humane Summit. We rely on your support to help create a more compassionate, just, and sustainable future through education. Visit hecoalition.org/give to contribute today. Thanks again.